You know, this conference this year, we're focusing on the battle of the faith of North America from 1700 to 1900. Or maybe more specifically, how has the church fared in America since Catholics were granted constitutional freedom of religion in 1789? A little over two. How have we fared in the last 200 years? That's what we're going to look at this weekend. 6 years ago, we inaugurated these conferences for several reasons, one of which was that we were inspired by that wonderful quote by John Henry Cardinal Newman, you know, to become deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. And those of you who are converts, most of us agree completely with that idea. Another is that we saw that the encroaching 500th anniversary of the day in which Luther posted the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg is only now 7 or 9 years away. And that sparked the Reformation. And so we've got a lot of work to do in the next 9 years to help Catholics as well as non-Catholics understand that that date was not necessarily a date to be celebrated, but maybe, you know, mea culpa. We need to work towards unity. And we need healing. In the process of planning these conferences, you know, we've recognized that it was actually much easier, or should I say less dangerous, whenever we focused on events and ideas and people that were in the way distant past. You know, the early church fathers, the German Reformation, the English Reformation, even when the faith came to America. I mean, that's a bit distant, but I think as I began focusing on the topic for this year, first I realized that there is so much to cover in the faith of America in the last 200 years. We certainly can't do it in one conference. There's no way. But on top of that, the closer we get to the present day, the more the topics that we're addressing start stepping on toes of people who are still affected by some of these ideas in America and have strong views about them. And I can tell you right now that the topic I'm going to discuss in a few minutes is a good example of this. I'll find people that will not agree at all with my perspective on what I'm going to present tonight. So I'll begin by saying, or maybe I should apologize, that we are certainly not going to address all the important issues of the 200 years of the Catholic faith in America since the American Revolution, and we certainly can't address every opinion on every subject. Now, I've asked our speakers, Rob and I have asked the speakers to choose subjects, not just that they are qualified as historians to address, but subjects that they really love, that they're really excited about. And so they plan to do that. You look at the list of our speakers for this weekend. So I guess I need to begin by saying, having said this, and I've got to say, for some reason, my computer isn't scrolling. That's going to be a real problem. Having said this, this caveat essentially leaves me out. I'm your opening speaker, not because I'm a qualified historian. I'm just one that loves to read history, and must say that one of the main reasons I'm a Catholic is because I read history. But as most of you know, I'm your opening speaker because I'm the founder and president of the Coming Home Network International, and Rob can't get rid of me. So I need to ask your prayerful indulgence. You notice as I'm speaking, I'm going back to this text a lot. And that isn't my norm. If any of you hear me speak, usually I prefer to grab this microphone, no notes, kind of walk around and preach and talk to you about the faith. That's what I would normally do. But that doesn't fit with the topic that I have to discuss tonight. I'm a little bit outside of my normal bounds here. So pray for me, all right? But listen to these things that I want to talk about and reflect on them, both in the life of our church, but in our own lives as we seek to follow Christ as Catholics or as non-Catholic Christians in this country of America. My topic for tonight is Catholics in the post-revolutionary America. Now, I'm going to begin by repeating something that I said last year, that like so many late blooming clergy converts until November 1991, when I was almost 40, I had never considered the validity of the Roman Catholic Church. Not a once. I had never knowingly read a book about the Catholic faith. I had never talked with a Catholic about the Catholic faith. Even in seminary, Protestant seminary, we never discussed what Catholics truly believe. I was essentially ignorant of the Catholic faith. Any of you like that for a good part of your life? All right, I'm not alone. I was never overtly or consciously anti-Catholic. I had accepted the usual anti-Catholic claims, but I don't remember how or where I learned them. Certainly not from my parents. I may have picked them up in my early years when I learned Luther's shorter catechism as a young Lutheran, but again, I do not recall this specifically. My view of the Catholic Church essentially was full of misinformation, though. I also knew very few Catholics, and those I knew, especially in college, weren't the best models of being a Catholic. I won't mention their names. I also need to mention that up until age 40, I never heard of a non-Catholic minister becoming Catholic. I knew of many Catholics, lay and clergy, who had become Protestant. 30% of my congregations that I pastored 4 as a Protestant minister, 30% of them were all ex-Catholics. But the only Protestants I knew who had become Catholic did so through marriage. And I presumed that they must not have known their faith very well if they would so quickly become Catholics. I was like those who presumed that becoming deep in history would make you a Protestant. I believed that. Of course, I found out that wasn't true. Now at age 35, or should I say 56, and a Catholic for nearly 16 years, it's not easy to remember what I learned as a young man about American history, specifically about the Catholic faith in that period following the Revolution. Essentially, I accepted that America was a land of the free and a home of the brave, where all of us are free to live and believe as we like. That's how I understood America, my life as an American. But in all my years of studying American history, the Catholic Church and Catholics were rarely mentioned, even as the Catholic Church, now hear this, grew within 50 years of the Constitution to become the largest single religious group in America by 1850. In my religious training, the Roman Catholic Church was always on the periphery, either as a threat to political or religious freedom, or as the prime example of how religion can go bad, tainted by superstitions, pride, immorality, works-righteous theology, or power-hungry prelates. Of course, we know that to be false, right? Well, there have been times in history where all those things have been true, but not in the norm. And not for faithful Catholics, prelates, and priests, and bishops, and popes. Even in seminary, as far as the history of the church in America, I remember our focus always being primarily on the church in New England. And this may be because my own focus in seminary was on the English Puritans. I loved New England Puritanism. I pictured myself a modern New England Puritan, following Jonathan Edwards. Consequently, my own attention was usually within the sphere of Protestantism, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, Anabaptist, Quaker, Church of England, and the various independents, and then on the constant battles within Protestantism between liberalism and evangelization, social gospel. These were the issues I focused on. Roman Catholicism was essentially a relic of the past, overturned with the dust kicked off our feet. And those countries that were still enslaved by Romanism, France and Spain, we always saw as our natural enemies, the enemies of political and religious freedom. You ever notice so many old novels, historical novels about America, the old movies about America, the French were always the bad guys. Of course, then I discovered that my background's French, and so I had to change my understanding of that. Grodi used to be Grenadin, French-Canadian, Catholic, which I never knew. But then when grace opened my heart and mind to the truth of the Catholic Church, praise be to God, and my wife and I came into the church, praise be to God. All my kids are good, faithful Catholics, praise be to God. I began reading history all over again. And not just church history, but all aspects of world and American history to discover what I had learned incorrectly. And there was a lot of stuff. And I'm 16 years into it, just still reading a history book every day and still discovering ways in which I've been blind to many of the things I'm going to talk about tonight, blind to how those have influenced me all my life. I also learned in a way I had never previously realized why during the entire colonial period from 1620 until 1789, when the Constitution was finally ratified, from the colonies to the ratification of the Constitution, there were essentially no Catholics in New England. That's wild to think about. I never realized that. There were essentially no Catholics in New England, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. A Puritan Congregationalist living in Massachusetts in this period could easily have lived his entire life and never met a Catholic or heard anyone teach the true Catholic faith. Now, last year I examined 6 things that shaped the faith in America before 1789. And they were 6 things. What did the early immigrants bring with them? What was their thinking in relationship to the Catholic Church? 2, why did they come from England to America in relationship to the Catholic Church? 3, what did they do once they arrived on these shores in relationship to the Catholic Church? 4, how and what did they learn about the Roman Catholic Church as they lived through this whole colonial period? 5, how had they in fact found the new Jerusalem that they were looking for in these wilderness regions in relationship to the Catholic Church? And then sixthly, how then, given all this, were any of them converted to the Catholic Church? Were there any conversions during that period before the Revolution? Now, if you're interested in that, you can go buy my tape in the lobby, because I don't have time to review all that. Actually, that whole selection of talks from last year are superb. I highly recommend them on the coming of the faith to America. But let me say simply a couple things. That basically, as a result, in summary of what I gave last year, basically, as a result of the penal laws and the prejudices of colonial Protestant America at the time of the War of Independence, there were throughout the whole United States, and we're not counting Louisiana or Florida yet, there were over 3 million inhabitants, only about 30,000 Catholics. Less than 1% of the citizens in the United States at the time of the Revolution were Catholics. And that's, I wish I had more time to talk about this, but that's amazing when you think that the original faith brought to these shores was Catholic, the French and the Spanish. But by this time, that was gone in the United States, essentially. These scattered few Catholics were ministered to by maybe 25 ex-Jesuits, and they were ex-Jesuits because the Society of Jesus had just recently been suppressed. And so these ex-Jesuit priests were now secular priests, but with no head in America. They were essentially responsible directly to Rome, way over the pond. The Catholic Church did not exist in the 13 original states as an organized body. The scarcely distributed and hidden Catholics were under the distant jurisdiction of the Vicar Apostolate of the London District, who for a time was Bishop Challoner. You may have heard that name in the revision of the Douay-Rheims Bible. He was the head of our church in America before the Revolution. But he never set foot on this continent but he was in charge of it. The majority of Catholics lived in Maryland, Pennsylvania. For example, the Catholics living in Baltimore were visited once a month by a roaming priest, and the Catholics of New York had to go to Philadelphia to receive the sacraments. So if you complain about not having a church at your local parish, remember how things began here in America for many, many years. Many Catholics fought for independence from England, and with this they hoped it would also bring freedom from the English penal laws. But many, like the majority, actually, of colonial Americans, really weren't sure which side to throw their hat, loyalist or rebel. A lot of them played it cool, Catholic or non-Catholic, because for Catholic perspective, neither the English government nor their American Protestant neighbors had ever treated them with equal respect if they tried to live their Catholic faith. And so usually they kept it to themselves. Well, then came independence from England, and in 1789, the Constitution was ratified. The 6th article of the federal Constitution reads thus: "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under these United States." Now that statement, radically new, along with others, which you need to know that when that Constitution was floating around to get ratified, there were a lot of places in the 13 colonies that didn't like it. But as a result of this and other statements in the Constitution, liberty of worship was granted to Catholics, and granted because of that, various states did not honor that in various ways. In reality, how this Constitution freedom was rationed out in practice is not always a proud story, and this is part of what we'll be discussing this weekend. In many cases, individual states still required declarations in line with the old penal codes before an office could be held by a Catholic in this country. And some of these states continue to exclude Catholics by name until a much later period, as many as in fact, I've heard recently, there are even still some penal codes still on the books, though not practiced. Now, what I'd like to do in this talk tonight is briefly discuss 8 things, 8 influences or ideas or facts about the situation of that period that I believe have most shaped Catholicism since 1789. There are, of course, many other issues and people and events and things that have happened that have shaped the church, and a more informed and qualified historian probably would have a different list of 8 that he probably would, much more educated, figure out are important. But from my reading, these are 8 things that I really think are important. And you'll hear other things this weekend along with what I will give now. But I believe that these 8 things, ideas, influences, are crucial to understanding what happened in Catholicism in America, both directly after the Constitution, and yet they continue today. And as I give you these 8, I want you to think in relationship to being a Catholic. Imagine being a Catholic in this country. Immediately you're free to worship when you've never been, but also think about whether these things influence the church in which we live in today. Let me also say that each of these 8 could easily warrant an entire lecture, some of them even an entire weekend. So I can only scratch the surface. My goal is kind of pricking your interest, something that you never thought about, an idea, and see how that influences our own faith, the faith of your neighbors, and maybe it'll be a great discussion topic for around the kitchen table here at the conference, or maybe even further reading on your part. And let me also add that I have edited and re-edited this thing so many times that sometimes I can't make out whether the words are from a source that I stole it from or they're my words. So forgive me if I don't give you all the sources. I've been working on this, part of this, for over a year in relationship to something else I'm writing. So if you want to know the sources, I can give them to you later. Here are the 8 things. Are you ready? In fact, when I give you the first one, you're going to realize this could be a huge topic. Number 1, the victory of the Enlightenment and deism. It's one of the main things that happened in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It changed our lives as Americans. Certainly one of the most significant changes in the entire history of the world was the rise in the mid-18th century of the so-called Enlightenment. These new ideas, which were shaped and promoted by such men as Bacon, Hobbes, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Thomas Paine, led their convinced followers to believe that they had finally become enlightened. What were the basic ideas of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason? Well, this could be a huge weekend conference. Let me give you 4. Number 1, and listen to these. Do they sound familiar? Number 1, that human reason was the most trustworthy source of knowledge, not faith, nor the authority of God's revealed word and his church. Thus, the social and physical sciences and the natural virtues were emphasized over revealed religion and the supernatural virtues, and the laws of nature were held and promoted over the laws of God and his church. Sound familiar? I just shocked someone back there. Number 2, that man is not fallen, that there is no such thing as original sin, and thus man has no need of a Savior and a divinely revealed religion. Jesus was simply a great moral teacher, and man in his own human interest became more important than knowing God, loving God, and serving him. Thus, rights became more important than duty. Rights became more important than duty. Number 3, that the concept of freedom would no longer be defined as primarily the freedom from sin, falsehood, and error, which includes the power to overcome sin, to do God's will, and know the truth. Rather, freedom was redefined as the freedom to believe and live the way one wanted. Freedom also was redefined to mean liberty from authority outside of oneself, liberty from the church and the king, hence the concept of self-government. And number 4, that politics and social life would no longer be governed by the laws of God and the church. Thus, men could invent their own laws, their own morals, their own beliefs. Freedom was now understood as the liberty to decide for ourselves how we will live according to what we think and feel is best, not according to what God has decreed and his church teaches. Isn't it great that all those ideas passed away long ago? This false enlightenment spawned a religion called deism. Influential colonial leaders like Samuel and John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and others were all deists who promoted the false enlightenment ideas. Deists did not believe in a personal God who was interested or involved in our individual lives, nor a God who revealed truths that men were to believe and follow. Instead, deists believed in a watchmaker God, you probably heard that description, who after he created everything and imposed natural governing laws, stepped back and then let it run on its own. This was a radically different God than that professed by the traditional Puritans, the Anglicans, the Dissenters, or the Catholics. Now, I have to say, contrary to what many modern revisionist evangelicals would like to suggest, and I was a part of that camp, we'd like to suggest that this country was founded by Christians, our Christian founding fathers, and we look for quotes from them. But the evidence is there that our founding fathers, most of them, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, particularly Franklin, were deists who rejected the divinity of Christ. Jefferson called Trinitarianism papism. And the idea that religion was supernaturally revealed. They all surprisingly, though, believed that religion was absolutely necessary to the success of democracy. And that's why we read back and we think, well, Jefferson must have been a Christian because he said how important religion was. But they saw it more in a practical way, a way of curbing immorality. But they themselves were far from practicing Christians. One of the most popular expressions of these ideas in colonial America was the much-read and very influential book by Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, in which this is what Paine states: I do not believe in the creed professed by the Roman Church, by the Greek Church, by the Protestant Church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. Now wrestle with that statement. My own mind is my own church. As a result, they believe that we are free, by God's permission, to think for ourselves and to believe whatever our conscience tells us is true. Boy, I've heard that recently. They also certainly believed that there was no place for church authority, for sacraments, and ordained priesthood, and especially miracles. Superstition. We're enlightened. We don't believe in those things. Of course, as a result of that, you know that they started saying that even the miracles in the Bible must not have happened, and that began that whole German critique of the Scriptures. All these ideas had a major influence on the concepts that shaped the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In time, these ideas would lead to more than just the American Revolution. They would lead to a series of revolutions against traditional Christian social and moral order throughout the Western world, and there's no better example of what happened just within 10 years after our own revolution, and that was the French Revolution, which was a disaster, if you've ever read the details. Before 1789, and this I find interesting, it was before the Constitution, it was nearly impossible for a Catholic to live in America and remain a faithful Catholic due to the demands of the various oaths of allegiance. You could not take those oaths honestly and remain an honest Catholic. That was the problem they had in England, and it came here. But after 1789, after the Constitution, it became just as difficult for a Catholic to live as a faithful Catholic and an American because of these extreme Enlightenment, deistic, and naturalistic ideas. Catholics were now free to worship, spread their faith, but the constant growing pressure of these ideas became too much for many Catholics to resist. And in time, they became adopted in different aspects of American Catholicism. I'd like to maybe suggest a modern parallel. Some of you can remember the 1950s. It's completely impossible to imagine that in the 1950s, the free public majority voice could in any way have been in support of gay marriage in the 1950s. Absurd. Those who were for this change, who were for gay marriage, hid in the closet, but nobody on either side of the issue, we didn't even talk about the issue then, it was so unfathomable. No one would have ever dreamed that we would be where we are today. No way. Where the free public majority voice seems to be for gay marriage. Today, those who have the audacity to speak against gay marriage are labeled intolerant, uneducated, unenlightened. But a battle's looming. Right? We're not going to let some of these issues take over our country. I've got a good friend that spoke at this conference who's a journalist in England, Joanna Bogle. And she cannot write in print the teachings of the church without being in danger of being arrested in England. Now, similarly, in the guise of Rip Van Winkle, you've got to read that book if you haven't read it in a long time. In the 1750s, 200 years before our 1950s, the free public majority voice was conservative in religion, believed in truth and the supernatural, believed in the divinity of Christ and the Blessed Trinity, and believed that which church you belonged to mattered. And admittedly, it sometimes led to intolerant sectarianism, but they believed. They believed. The growing numbers of advocates of liberal Unitarianism and the Enlightenment philosophies were still the odd men out, and in the less vocal minority. The Revolution and the Constitution changed all this. By 1800, 200 years ago, the outspoken majority voices in America were pushing the enlightened, Unitarian, deist, non-supernatural agenda. The battle was brewing and looming because again, you might hear some of this weekend, but one of the things that happened in the 1800s was a lot of backlash from conservatives, Catholics and non-Catholics, against these issues. In Protestantism, we saw the rise of the Know-Nothings and the rise of the Mormons and the Millerites, often in reaction to the spread of these liberal ideas. Okay, that's point number one. Right? Now, the others are going to be shorter. That was a biggie. I guarantee, because I'm going to stay on time this year. I'm trying. That was the biggie. One of the biggest influences that Catholics had to face now that they had freedom of religion in America. Number two, the religious toleration instituted by the Constitution was only skin deep. Does that make sense? It was on the paper, but to what extent did it change hearts? Though the Constitution established freedom of religion, the resulting toleration, especially among pre-revolutionary anti-Catholic Puritan Americans, was only on the surface. The fear that came from the passage of the Quebec Act that was passed in 1774, which established the freedom of the practice of the Catholic faith in Canada. And actually, it was one of the main things that started the American Revolution, because all of a sudden, the entire northern territories down through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, all of that area, French Catholicism could freely be practiced, and they were on our borders. And if I had time, I could give you quotes from Sam Adams and John Adams that basically said, the main reason we're doing this, folks, is to make sure this country doesn't become papist. Essentially, they said that. But the fear that was in America before the Revolution didn't automatically just evaporate once the Constitution was passed. It was not all that different than racism in the 1960s. Laws established and enforced emancipation and tolerance in America, but this did not instantaneously rid America of racism. We know that. It's in here, not always up here. During the first years after 1789, the majority outspoken voice was not that, the majority outspoken voice was that of toleration. Those with lingering anti-Catholic sentiments, grateful to the help we had received from Catholic France, without which we couldn't have won the war, and they were Catholic, and because George Washington, our most beloved leader, was basically saying, treat them equally, they helped us. So most of the intolerant folk got on the bandwagon, bought with the program. They basically, admittedly in a patronizing sense, tried to hold their tongue and let their Catholic neighbors alone. And you can see that in lots of newspaper articles and stuff that I wish I had time to share with you. It's pretty fascinating. But as the Catholic population grew, I don't want to say like rabbits, but I didn't say that. And began taking advantage of the freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by not only worshiping in public, but building churches and schools and colleges and convents, even seeking public office. those anti-Catholic sentiments rose violently to the surface. There's lots of evidence of that. We may talk about some of that this weekend. But one of the most memorable happened in 1835 when the first Ursuline convent built in New England, in Charlestown, was burnt to the ground by a crazed mob that had marched from Boston, who had just been fired up by an overzealous anti-Catholic Boston Congregationalist preacher. And they marched over to and burnt the convent down. And I might just note that the reason I'm very connected to that is I'm going to talk about John Thayer later. I'm writing a book about John Thayer. When he died, he left a will of $10,000. It was his money that built that convent. And it was that convent was then burnt down. It's such an irony. Okay, that's number two, this remaining intolerance under the surface. Number three, Catholic Americans were poorly catechized. All right, due primarily because of the long absence and lack of priests and religious in pre-revolutionary America, 3 to 4 generations of Catholics, living often in secret, received little formal religious education. Catholic schools were illegal, and most religious education was passed down from parent to child. Now, today we probably think that's a great thing. Did you hear me? Okay. Given some of our situations, but in those days, when you think about it, many of them came from England in the 1600s and had poor catechesis in England. They came to America where there were no priests, 3 or 4 generations with no education. I mean, think about how accurately, to what extent Catholic faith was passed on in the midst of a community where you're pressured by all this Puritanism and Anglicanism and Quakerism all the time. Wealthy Catholics sent their children to Europe for a Catholic education, but the majority were either taught at home or went to non-Catholic schools. It's understandable then that by the time of the Constitution, many, if not most, Catholics could not distinguish clearly the doctrines of their own Catholic faith from the doctrines of their Protestant neighbors. Many times they may have bought the myths that their neighbors believed about them. And so many Catholics would have had a hodgepodge of understanding, not just in their beliefs, but in their morality. The state of the Catholic morality in America was a mess. And then when priests began arriving, who had been trained in Europe, many American Catholics were resistant, if not downright resentful, when these new priests began challenging the beliefs they had learned from their parents, or especially when they began telling them not to live this way. That was a mess in the early days of the 1800s with these new priests, especially Bishop John Carroll trying to rein it all in. Number 4, Catholic Americans lacked sacramental graces. We certainly recognize that in our Heavenly Father's providence and mercy, He blesses those who are invincibly ignorant and innocently unable to receive the sacraments. However, we also recognize that our faith is not merely a different set of beliefs and practices from those of our Protestant neighbors. Ours is a sacramental faith through which we receive the graces necessary to live faithful and holy lives. Without these graces, we're on our own. We need the sacraments. They're a gift of Christ. One of the things that St. Paul warns St. Timothy in his second letter about, that one of the signs of the last days was that people would hold a form of religion but deny the power of it. That's in 2 Timothy 3. They would hold a form of religion, but deny the power. In other words, reduce the faith to mere forms, practices, ideas, but deny the reality of the power, the sacraments, and the graces to change lives. I just read an entire book about the American gospel. It's on the shelf over there. It's very fascinating. But the author in the book, in describing all the different beliefs of America, not once does it seem he believes that religion is powerful. It's merely a bunch of ideas. This is descriptive of the days after the Reformation as well as today. Like their neighbors, most of the 3 to 4 generations of Catholics who lived their entire lives in the colonies before the Constitution had received few of the sacraments. They might receive baptism and confession and the Eucharist whenever a roaming priest made a visit, but many American-born Catholics were baptized and married outside the church. It became very common. In fact, when I first saw this, it just shocked me. No American-born Catholic from 1620, if they were born in America, until after the Revolution, no American-born Catholic had ever received confirmation in America, except those who were wealthy enough to go to Europe. And why is that? Because confirmation is done only by a bishop. We had no bishop in America until Bishop Carroll. That was one of the main reasons that Vicar Apostolate Challoner kept asking Rome to appoint another Vicar Apostolate in the colonies, even before the Revolution, so that the sacrament of confirmation could be given to those scattered Catholics. It's understandable, therefore, that even though the Constitution in 1789 made living and worshiping as a Catholic a legal right, it didn't ensure that Catholics were prepared catechetically or sacramentally to do this. Point 5. The increased Catholic immigration brought divisions. The prejudices, the national hatreds of the old countries, right? Ireland, France, Germany, Scotland, England, Italy, etc., all of which abhorred each other before they came, that didn't just automatically go away. They didn't just start loving each other when they landed on this coast. Just witness the many ethnic Catholic communities and separate ethnic churches across America. They weren't all formed out of hatred, but I've read some of the histories, and sometimes some of these ethnic churches were formed out of a separatist protest against another ethnic group right across the street. That's true in Zanesville, Ohio. That's true in Steubenville, Ohio. We couldn't expect them, coming from where they came from, to automatically be free of that. One of the first Catholic schisms in America happened when a German congregation in Philadelphia voted to separate themselves from the newly ordained Bishop Carroll. In other words, separate themselves from Rome. Many of the lay trustees who were fighting against Bishop Carroll in the early days of the 19th century believed that they were upholding the just rights of their parish against one who they believed was not one of their own. Why? To the Germans, Dr. Carroll was Irish. To the French, he was English. To the Irish, he was English, or at least pro-French. I mean, Bishop Carroll, could you imagine what Bishop Carroll had to deal with when he was given this very small parish of North America? Nearly all the early priests and bishops of post-revolutionary America fought against the divisions caused by battling ethnic Catholics. Point 6. This is an interesting one. I'd love to explore this one better. Regional American English accents exacerbated these divisions. This is a fascinating study. The different English colonies were generally settled by groups of immigrants from similar regions in England. New England, for example, was primarily from the very Puritan, pro-Parliament East Anglia region of England, which is east of London. If you go over there, kind of northeast of, it's in that little part of England. While Virginia and Maryland came mostly from royalist regions, pro-king regions, and a lot of it was the north and the west of England. This can be seen by comparing the names of towns and regions. Most of the earliest towns of Massachusetts are all duplicates of where they came from in eastern England. These regions in England were far from friendly to each other, and this was particularly expressed in the English Civil War, which was in fact the precursor to our own revolution and our own Civil War. The American colonies were all started either just before or during the rise of the conflicts between the king and the parliament that led to the English Civil War. Many of those who came from England brought with them this hatred, either of the king and his family's long rule or hatred for the upstart parliament. And generally those who were for parliament settled in New England, and those who were for the royalists, for the kings, often settled in Virginia and Maryland. Now, these regions in England had different and distinct accents. And you know how we can explore that? Remember that play called My Fair Lady? George Bernard Shaw, who wrote Pygmalion, kind of played with that idea, and we hear it through My Fair Lady. That's just London that they're emphasizing. But East Anglia and Cornwall and the different parts of England had radically different accents, and the immigrants from these areas brought with them these respective accents to their areas of America, and these accents are the seeds for our present accents in America. The Catholics who lived in these regions shared these accents, and often the same prejudices that came with those accents that they brought from the different regions of England. This became even more intensified as regional English became transmogrified through the influence of second language English-speaking immigrants, right? You've got the Italians and the French and the Germans and the Dutch who are now speaking English, I think, in these different regions, and they're influencing the accents, and pretty soon we have these major divisions, which in fact causes early divisions in the church. This also further solidified the ethnic divisions within the American church and between Catholics and their non-Catholic neighbors. It also made it difficult for priests from one region in America to minister to Catholics in another region. And this is particularly true for the man I'm going to talk about tomorrow night, Father John Thayer. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. He was educated in Yale. He became the chaplain to John Hancock during the Revolution. He went to Europe, was converted in Rome, became a priest studying in Paris, and then came back. And I'm telling you, from the time he landed to the time he went back to Europe 14 years later, he did nothing but butt heads with the Irish and the French immigrants, and especially the slave-owning Virginians and Marylanders and Kentuckians who could not miss the politics in his Boston accent. I mean, it was terrible. It still goes on today. I know parishes where when a well-educated Eastern priest shows up in a church, that people are saying, "Who is he to tell us what to believe?" Because they're offended by his uppity accent. Number 7, and I was told I had an hour, so I'm going to keep it in that. Number 7, trusteeism. The right to administer church property belongs to the church. In other words, the right to administer church, little c, property belongs to the church, big C. This right can be delegated to others, cleric or lay, as accessory administrators, and these deputies have traditionally been known as church wardens and trustees, etc. This is an old standing tradition in the church that actually went through some major changes during the Reformation and also during the Council of Trent. But here in the United States, lay trustees have been strong from the very earliest days of the church. In no way were laymen ever empowered to interfere in or to direct the spiritual rights of the pastor or the spiritual rights and life of the people. But due to the extreme lack of priests to minister to the wide and sparse distribution of Catholics, lay trustees or wardens in some places, especially New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Norfolk, Charleston, Boston, and especially Wilderness, Kentucky, claimed this authority. It took many years, several consuls in Baltimore, and a bunch of papal letters to bring all of this to a proper adjustment. The heart of the dispute was whether the right to choose and release a pastor lay with the congregation, which had purchased and cleared the land, built the church and the rectory, assured the support of the pastor, or whether it rested with the bishop. Their Puritan Congregationalist neighbors claimed and practiced this right. I was originally a congregational minister. Every individual church had all the authority to do whatever it wanted. I could be hired on Sunday, fired on Monday. They were completely free to do that. It's their church. And many American-born Catholics had never known any other system. There was no bishop. There were no priests, a few. That's why many of them were very resistant to the idea of even having a bishop. That's a whole other story. But in the early days of our first bishop, John Carroll, whenever he came in conflict with lay trustees, often a priest was their leader. And sometimes these were emigrant priests who had fled from persecution in France, Ireland, Germany, etc., and sometimes who arrived on our American shores without faculties. Some were renegade priests looking for a brand new start where nobody knew them. Bishop John Carroll wrote, "Sometimes the intruder priest received from the trustees a pretended appointment to the pastoral office, that is, the power of loosening and binding, of administering the Holy Eucharist to the faithful of God's church, of teaching and preaching and performing all these duties, which, being in their nature entirely spiritual, can never be within the jurisdiction of or subject to the dispensation of the laity. These turbulent men who foment the present disturbance have declared themselves independent of Christ's vicar as of a foreign jurisdiction." That was a big problem in the early days of the church in America. The question was, who is in charge of the local parish? The bishop, the priest, or the laity? And once again, it's really good that that's no longer a problem. Point number 8, Americanism. Americanism is defined as, quote, and I got this from catholicculture.org, the movement propagated in the United States in the late 19th century which claimed that the Catholic Church should adjust its doctrines, especially in morality, to the culture of the people, emphasizing the active virtues of social welfare and democratic equality. It underrated the passive virtues of humility and obedience to ecclesiastical authority. Americanism was first condemned by Pope Leo XIII in his apostolic letter of January 1899, just before the turn of the century, Testem Benevolente. I'm not very good at doing Latin there. This topic is very controversial, and it is certainly beyond the scope of this brief talk, primarily because ever since the time Americanism was declared a heresy by Pope Leo XIII, many American Catholic leaders, clerical and laity, have claimed that this was nothing more than a big misunderstanding, that this heresy never really existed in America. It's not here. Right? Well, I, however, must admit that it seems obvious to me that not only has Americanism been very much a problem since the mid-19th century, continuing on to this day, promoted especially in far too many Catholic colleges, universities, and seminaries, and therefore has spread to our local dioceses and sometimes to our own parishes, but it has been a problem in America from the very beginning. Unlike the French and the Spanish colonists, the Catholics who came here from France and Spain came here to evangelize. You see that in all their documents and the reasons they came. Sure, they wanted to get gold also, but they wanted to convert the non-believers. English Catholics, on the other hand, came primarily to escape the anti-Catholic penal laws of England. When they arrived on these shores, however, they found that these laws and attitudes were still applied in great force. And to avoid detection and persecution, they chose to lay low, to fit in, to downplay their Catholicism, and especially to avoid attempting to spread the faith and convert their neighbors. Remember I said there were no conversions that we know of in America from anyone who hadn't left America. Actually, the only converts that we can log in those years were those that had been captured by the Indians and taken to Canada, where they were converted to Catholicism, and actually 1/5 of those who were captured did not want to come back. They wanted to stay in Catholic North Canada. As a result, many immigrant Catholics were able to prosper, not as Catholic Americans, but as Americans who in their private lives were Catholics. One major example of this, and I don't want to lambaste a family, but I'm just going on a lot of stuff I've read, and just take this for what it's worth, that one of the main examples of this actually very well may have been the Carroll family. The first real Catholic family to gain true prominence in the United States. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland, was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was the wealthiest man in the American colonies, and quite chummy with all the founding fathers, some of whom were virulent anti-Catholics. But most of his life, Charles Carroll was at best a nominal Catholic, and all his children who survived childhood were married outside the church. It was only in his later years that he returned to the active practice of his faith. And his cousin, John Carroll, trained and ordained a Jesuit priest in Europe, became our first bishop. He certainly had a monumental task on his hands, trying to bring order as well as spiritual nurture to his diocese, which was the entire United States. Yet in many of his communications and his methods, we detect a downplaying of any overt connection between the American church and Rome. His emphasis was on making the life for Catholics in America better and freer, and opportunities more accessible for Catholics, but rarely do we read about him emphasizing the need to reach out and convert our neighbors. And then there's John Carroll's brother, Daniel, was one of the two Catholics who helped frame the Constitution itself in 1789. He was most influential on the addition of the Freedom of Religion Clause. And he, in fact, owned and then donated the very land upon which the U.S. Capitol was eventually erected. I don't want to go into all the issues, but all of them had Masonic connections. I don't want to go there right now. The irony is, and of course the Masonic is connected to the Enlightenment ideas. The irony is that non-Catholics continued, this is really amazing, non-Catholics continued to believe that most Catholic leaders in the United States, like their counterparts in Europe and Latin America, intended to go out and convert the nation. But that wasn't high on the agenda. Seeing this suspicion, therefore, many Catholics in America, especially many clergy, became even more determined to demonstrate that they were as American as anybody else. When Pope Leo XIII addressed this problem in 1899 in his encyclical declaring Americanism a heresy, he based this idea on this first principle. Let me read this from his encyclical, and then we're at the conclusion. The underlying principle of these new opinions is that in order to more easily attract those who differ from her, the Church should shape her teachings more in accord with the spirit of the age and relax some of her ancient vigor and make some allowances to new opinions. Many think that these allowances should be made not only in regard to ways of living, but even in regard to doctrines which belong to the deposit of faith. They contend that it would be opportune in order to gain those who differ from us, to omit certain points of her teaching as if of lesser importance, and to tone down the meaning which the church has always attached to them. It does not need many words, beloved son, and he's writing to Cardinal Gibbons in America. He says, beloved son, to prove the falsity of these ideas, if the nature and origin of the doctrine which the church proposes are recalled to mind. All right, in conclusion, a couple things. These 8 things, or influences, or realities about the state of Catholicism after the American Constitution, there's lots of other things I could add, set the American Catholic Church, in fact, I'd rather say the Catholic Church in America, on a trajectory from 1789 onward. In many ways, to this day, we continue to experience and to suffer under the negative effects of these influences, these Enlightenment ideas, lingering anti-Catholicism, poor catechesis, divisions within the church, and lingering Americanism. And we're going to hear a little bit about some of that this weekend. But of course, there have been many, many positive, conservative, faithful voices, clergy, bishops, religious, laity, throughout the past 200 plus years that have fought to establish, to protect, to preserve, to spread, and to defend the Catholic Church here in America now that we are free to live this faith. And you'll hear about this weekend, and I'm very excited to talk to you tomorrow night about one of the great heroes in my heart, and that's Father John Thayer, the first American-born Protestant clergy convert priest. He's our patron saint. I'll talk to you about tomorrow night. But given the influence of these 8 things on the church in America over the past 200 years, I think it is particularly beneficial for us to ponder prayerfully to what extent these 8 things continue to influence and shape the witness and practice of the Catholic Church in America, especially today, 2 weeks away from election. But we need to ask God to confront ourselves, to open our own eyes to the ways that we ourselves may have been influenced and hindered and enticed by some of these ideas and influence. And I know personally that it has taken a long time for me to recognize the fallacy of many of the ideas that I accepted blindly in public school, college, and later in seminary. Lord, help us. May the Lord clear away the dross from our own minds so that we can follow him faithfully. God bless. Thank you very much.